Hi, this is Andy Liddell, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Gary Parker. Today we have episode 436 for July 7th, 2025. And today we've got a very informative and off-putting interview, honestly, with Andy Liddell from the EdTech Law Center. Not because of Andy, but because of the subject matter. We're going to be talking about education technology and its impact on our kids. And we talk a lot about privacy on this show, but we focus more on the perspective of an adult where we tend to have more choice. Not enough choice, mind you. There's still a lot we need to be doing for privacy for adults, but turns out it gets a lot worse when you're talking about kids, particularly in schools that often mandate the installation of things like smartphone apps, maybe to access school system stuff, and proctoring software for remote test taking. That's become more popular, certainly since COVID. And worse yet, in many cases, as we're going to find out today in the interview with Andy, the schools are the ones giving consent to personal data usage and even things like mandating binding arbitration on behalf of the kids, not the parents, and certainly not the students themselves, but the schools and the school systems. So the whole notion of notice of consent is really wonky when it comes to our kids, and it's not in a good way. Also in schools today, there's a lot of increased use of things like monitoring tools, of course now sprinkled with lots of AI, to look for things like cheating or bullying or even depression and maybe even self-harm or, trying to find kids before they do the next school shooting, that kind of thing. And while those sound like things we want to prevent, the automated surveillance apparatus that's used to do these things is very error-prone, and it's, of course, run by a third-party company, and those companies are highly incentivized to profit off the data they collect in any way they can. Marketing companies are just eating up all of this data on our kids. And of course, these profiles that are being generated for our kids don't just magically disappear when they leave school. This stuff could follow them forever. So, we're going to be talking about all that and much more today with Andy. And as we talk about the risks and the harms for our kids, in the end, Andy actually does have some great advice for parents and school policymakers. So there is potentially light at the end of this dark tunnel. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into our interview with Andy Liddell. Andy has been a federal courts litigator in Austin, Texas for the last 15 years. He and his wife, Julie, are co-founders of the EdTech Law Center, a consumer protection law firm dedicated to solving problems where school meets technology. And there's a lot of that, and we're going to talk about that today. Welcome to the show, Andy.
Thanks, Gary. Really, really excited to be here.
And I'm really glad that we had a chance to meet. We met up in D.C. Heidi put that together, and it was great to meet you in person before we got an interview. I rarely get to meet the people I interview, so I was really glad to spend some time with you beforehand. So this is a rare occurrence for me, but I enjoy it very much that we got a chance to meet first. Our consumer information has been harvested mercilessly from the web and our smartphone apps for many years now. And, most adults today are familiar at least with the basics of being tracked with cookies or giving too many permissions to our apps. But mining student data is kind of a different animal. Many schools require students to install third-party software, for like proctoring at-home exams, or, maybe they have web tools for submitting homework. And in some cases, school even issues special laptops or tablets to the kids. So it's different than what most adults are used to, I think, when we think about privacy and third parties. So we're going to get into that today. But before we start, why don't you tell us when and why did you start the EdTech Law Center? What's your mission there?
So our mission, you said it at the top, we solve problems where school meets technology. And we started the law firm in 2023. My wife, Julie, is my law partner, and she started it then. I supported her with a day job for a while and then was able to join her in January of this year full time. So it's the two of us. We are a consumer protection contingency law firm, meaning that people don't pay out of pocket for our services. They only pay if we win from the proceeds of the winnings. And we started this firm really as a continuation of our activism. We've been activists around youth digital civil rights since 2019. So for many years, predating COVID. And we've seen, as you mentioned, this data harvesting surveillance capitalist model be pushed into schools and onto kids And it's having all of these really negative effects. And so we got started as activists because of, a very immediate incident that happened to a young kid that I could tell you about. But understanding why that happened to him and the larger data environment that's driving these outcomes is also really crucial to our work.
What are some of the unique ways that the data of our minor children is in danger from EdTech companies? What data is being collected and how is it being abused? Different from what we're used to as adults in modern surveillance technologies.
Right. So a lot of the problem here is that this is total information collection on kids starting as early as kindergarten and sometimes younger. And it's everything that can be known about a person or that they do with a computer is being collected and used by education technology companies and their partners. It's happening in a very opaque way, so we don't know exactly what is being collected or exactly what is being used. But if we look at these companies' privacy policies and disclosures, what essentially they're seeming to admit to is that they share this information with dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of other partners. And they claim a right to do that essentially without parental consent. And so their position is, to boil it down, schools can consent as though they are parents. They have these contracts of adhesion, the click-through contracts a lot of times that aren't negotiated, that basically say we can take what we want, and by you letting kids use it, you agree. And so we essentially have this total data harvesting apparatus that exists to make decisions about kids without their knowledge and without their or their parents' consent. And so that's one of the problems.
That's a
the
big
data,
one.
it's a big one. The data collection business model misaligns incentives. And so companies are incentivized basically to capture school districts and to capture huge contracts over improving kids' educational outcomes, over keeping them safe online. The goal is just to penetrate and capture these public goods. And so that's another problem. And then the problem that got us into this is because of those misaligned incentives, kids are getting hurt in real immediate ways at school. So the data issues are problematic. The data even being used as advertised is an issue, notwithstanding that it's very vulnerable to hackers, which has happened. And so having your information stolen from you is its own harm. But I'm talking about, children on the probably less grievous but still very concerning end of the spectrum going to school and are put down in front of a computer and are just distracted all day long because the internet is right there. And we know the internet, because of its own business model, is extractive and manipulative. And we know that kids' brains aren't fully developed. And so the least bad thing that's happening is that we've got kids that are just spending all day long looking at YouTube shorts or on Snapchat or playing Fortnite or whatever it is. They're being blamed for this as being off task, but the better frame is they're being manipulated into doing this by the tools that they're being given. It only gets worse from there. We have clients that we're working with whose children have been exposed to, very young children have been exposed to pornography and ultra-violent content at school on a repeated basis. We have clients who have been sextorted because they've taken pictures of themselves with their school laptop and send them to adults. And this has happened at school, on the school laptop, in the school bathroom. We have kids who have been connected with sexual predators. Famously, Discord is a haven for these predators. And there was this ring of people, the 746 group that the FBI in 2023 put out a warning about, that essentially tortures kids online for fun. And so we've had people with close calls with that group. And we've had people who are mercilessly cyberbullied through their school computer that their school makes them take home, to the point of serious self-harm and damage to their self-esteem. And so all of those issues fundamentally, I think, flow from the data collection surveillance business model. But that's the stuff that got us into this in the first place, those real, tangible, immediate harms that kids are suffering at school, and that most people have no idea about because they just assume that because it comes from school, it's safe.
Right. Now, we don't have a lot of privacy laws in the U.S., but we do have some federal privacy laws specifically for minors and students. And so could you highlight some of the key statutes that govern data gathering for students? Like I'm thinking, I don't know how many of these apply, but COPPA, FERPA, I know some of these are some of the laws that were geared toward kids. But basically, what's the privacy legal landscape like, and how is it different for minors versus adults in the U.S.?
So historically, minors have enjoyed very, very robust privacy rights. You think about just traditionally, culturally, you've got all of these religious and cultural traditions. You've got, I recently went to a bat mitzvah for the first time, right? And you've got confirmation, you've got cotillion, you've got the debutante ball, right? This idea that there is a period that a child is not really, really well known to their community, and then there is this coming out party where you're made more known to this community, right? And so, just culturally, historically, kids have enjoyed a lot of privacy. The common law privacy rights that we all enjoy, especially kids, are really robust. But then there are these federal statutes that you mentioned that are meant to provide extremely strong additional protections, even over the other laws that we've enjoyed, over our other legal traditions, but other protections to students and their education records at school. And that's FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. And then also, especially to very young children online, which is COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act of 1998. So you'll notice those federal laws are, 50 and 30 years old, but they're still there, right? And so they're still very strong, robust laws. The challenge is that those laws don't allow private lawyers like myself to enforce them. And so we are reliant on some federal agencies, respectively, the Department of Education for FERPA and the Federal Trade Commission for COPPA, and state attorneys general to enforce these laws. And, in my humble opinion, they've gone under-enforced for a really long time.
So that's the so-called private right to action.
Correct. That those lack. So private right of action means that just any lawyer off the street can come and sue you if you've violated a law. FERPA and COPPA do not have a private right of action.
So, that comes up a lot when we're talking about privacy laws, and because a lot of the lobbyists fight really hard against having that in there. So could you give us a thumbnail sketch of what that means to be with and without a private right of action, and what that practically means? I know that there's like an ivory tower view of how things should work, and that is that these companies don't want to be subject to the whims of all these lawyers and all these quote unquote frivolous lawsuits or whatever. They want, there should be one agency in charge of this, and so let's centralize this. But in reality, does it tend to work that way? Give us an idea of how this is supposed to work and how it actually works.
Well, so how it's supposed to work is exactly that, right? So you have agencies that are charged with enforcing laws, and they are independent of the industries that they're overseeing. And they're not captured by industry priorities or industry dollars or industry thinking. So in theory, it could be great. The practical reality is that, of course, they are often captured by all of those things, in addition to, just kind of an industry mindset, a, pro-technology, pro-growth, pro-future mindset. I think the book Surveillance Capitalism only came out 6 years ago, right? And so that term, that framing of looking at the world is still relatively new. And also it's a 900-page book. And so I still think that most people really don't understand how the internet works and just how extractive and coercive and manipulative it is. And so, you have what's happened, at least here for the past 25 years, this ideology of big data. And that data equals progress, that everything can be quantified and datified. And if only we could collect enough data, we could solve all the world's problems. I am not going to speculate how sincere that is versus how cynical it is. But that's certainly been the prevailing thinking that has transcended administrations. This is not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. This is something that I think administrations for the past, frankly, 30 years since COPPA was initially passed, have all had a hand in allowing our current paradigm to be possible.
Given the practical, again, there's the ivory tower version, then there's what's actually happened. Because it's not even just that a lot of these agencies, or attorneys general for the states or whatever, who are often on the hook for pursuing these things as opposed to individual lawsuits, but sometimes they're underfunded, sometimes they're understaffed. It's not so much that it might not even be that they're in the pocket necessarily of these companies. There are a lot of other practical realities that prevent these companies from enforcing these things that we wish to enforce, right?
Oh, completely. Right. And so, Yes, because these agencies only have the ability to enforce commensurate with their funding and priorities too. And so if something like this happens, kind of it's obscured, it's hidden, it's inside the school walls. And so it's not something that most people even see or encounter. It's not something people are really thinking about. It certainly is not likely to be the top priority for most state attorneys general or these federal agencies, because they do oftentimes, at least they think, they have bigger fish to fry. And so, I think there is a really important role for private lawyers to play. And when you think about kind of the history of consumer protection in the United States, all the things that we just take for granted and enjoy now, many of them got their start because of, a lawyer like myself saw people getting hurt and started bringing lawsuits. And so think car safety and tobacco and opiates and social media, all those things first got the ball rolling by private law firms seeking to vindicate private rights.
All right, one more lawyer question. Well, there's probably, there's probably more, but on this particular topic, are these suits then, and when there is a private right to action, are the suits often representing an individual, or do they generally turn into class action lawsuits? How does that work?
So, right. So all of our lawsuits right now currently on file are data privacy lawsuits where we allege a company has exceeded the consent to collect information, basically by saying there is no consent. And so everything they've collected has been non-consensual. And these are class action lawsuits. And a class action lawsuit is different than a mass action lawsuit in the following way. And so a class action basically means one person can stand in the shoes of everybody just like them. So I use this kind of silly example of the $5 footlong from Subway. Well, if you went to Subway and it was actually only 11 inches, you'd be shortchanged. You wouldn't want to sue Subway for the rest of your sandwich. But if millions and millions of people were doing this, right, they're really saving a lot of money by ripping everybody off. And so what you can do is we have the $5 footlong class action, and we all get together, and you could be the representative of everybody who went to Subway and bought a sandwich that wasn't as advertised, right? And so that's the class action model, where the harm and the remedy are all kind of the same, and the company's bad acts. The mass action is a little bit different, and so those are more like the social media cases, the opiate cases, the asbestos cases, even the cigarette cases. Those are actually thousands of individual lawsuits that are often wrapped up and coordinated in a centralized proceeding, and that's because even though the originating bad acts are the same, the way those harms express themselves are different, right? And so if you think about like an opiates case or a cigarette case, getting lung cancer that's, caused you to have a lung removed, or getting throat cancer that caused you to have a voice box put in, or getting terminal cancer because of these things, the law would assign a different value to each of those, right? And so we can't just say that everybody gets a check for $50 or whatever, like we can in a class action context. But it's still important to coordinate those things. And so all I have to say, we're going to be bringing both types of cases. Right now, we're focused on just data privacy class action.
All right. Thank you. Perfect. All right. So you've already alluded to this, but let's talk about notice of consent, because we lean heavily on that in the United States for privacy laws.
Yes.
And it has a lot of problems, and I personally think it's a farce, but
yes.
But how does this work when we're talking about minors? Because that's a whole different ballgame. So how is notice given? Who can give consent? And I'm really curious, do kids have any rights they can assert in these situations?
Right. So notice and consent is, as you say, it's a farce, but the law treats it as real, right? So all of those contracts are real contracts, and companies can, be found liable in court for exceeding the terms of the consent and the notice that they've provided. So it's important to keep that in mind, that these are real contracts. The law treats these as real. And the law basically says, if you don't like it, you can lump it. You do not have to use these products. No one's making you be on Facebook, be on Gmail, use Google Maps. You can actually do other things as an adult consumer. You can choose differently if you don't like it, as long as what they're saying is adequately disclosed. Oftentimes we found that these big tech companies exceed the notice that they provide consumers. And so Google, for example, was sued for exceeding the notice of its practices with relation to incognito mode. And so, incognito mode, people were led to believe collected no information about the user at all whatsoever. Inspections showed that actually more information was taken than was disclosed and that people understood. And the result of that was Google agreed to delete the equivalent of $5 billion worth of information that it collected by exceeding the consent that people provided. Well, in the education context, there's a lot that's different, right? Kids are not adults, first of all. They're not consumers. The environment that they're in is compulsory, right? You have to go to school and you have a right to go to school. And so the first point is that they're minors. And so in the law, the age of contract majority is 18 in, I think, every state in the union. It might be 21 still in like Louisiana, but don't quote me on that. But interestingly, the age of contract majority used to be higher. It used to be 21.
Oh, really?
And only recently, only during the Vietnam War, when there were disputes about the draft age relative to the voting age, did the voting age fall and the age of contract majority fell. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, the age to which you could enter into a contract, you had to be 21. And so it's really interesting that, the age of majority has fallen from 21 to 18. And then online under COPPA, what people say COPPA is like, well, 13 is the age of consent on the internet. That is a complete misunderstanding and misapprehension of that rule. That only gives parents extra rights and imposes extra duties on companies that are providing internet products to kids under 13. It doesn't mean that a 13-year-old can effectively consent as long as that consent is obtained over the internet. That's not what the law says. And so you notice that I mentioned that states set the age of consent historically. So a federal law doing that just for kids just on the internet probably wouldn't pass muster anyway, right? And so we have all of these problems. And so if FERPA, which was really meant to limit access to and use of students' education records following the abuses of the late 60s and the student radical movement and stuff, where, the wrong people were getting access to student records and using them against these kids. And so if we took FERPA seriously and said that really student records should only truly be used for education purposes, and there is no secondary market in information collected about kids at school or through school, that would make a big difference. But FERPA only actually regulates schools, right? The enforcement mechanism of FERPA is that if a school violates the law, then the Department of Education can withhold federal funding from the school. So it's a really, really harsh penalty, and it's the only lever that they have, which I think, to our earlier point, is possibly what leads to under-enforcement of FERPA, because nobody wants to be seen taking money away from our struggling public schools, even in cases of egregious violation, right? And so there's that aspect of it, that FERPA only regulates schools. And so the only protection that FERPA provides is when a school permits student information to be disclosed to an education technology company, the Department of Education can't come after the school. FERPA does not give these companies additional rights to monetize information collected at school. It doesn't do anything because it doesn't regulate companies, it regulates schools.
Interesting. Okay.
COPPA, the other law, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, is supposed to do just what it says, protect kids online. And it regulates providers of internet services to kids under 13. The way that companies get around this is they play dumb. They say, oh, well, we don't know. This isn't for kids under 13. And they'll put in their privacy policy or their terms of use, not for use for kids under 13. I mean, I've seen, because I've looked at a million of these privacy policies lately for these EdTech companies, where they will, in the app, they will link to their website privacy policy. And then on the website, they will say, this website is not intended for users under 13, right? And so it's just this crazy thing of like, what are we even doing here? And so first is the playing dumb angle, where we don't know that our users are under 13. We say they shouldn't be, and so we don't have to abide by any of the protections of FERPA. But FERPA is really meant to all but eliminate collection of information about users under 13 online. I mean, that's really what it's meant to do. Is that's supposed to be an extremely narrow set of information.
You said FERPA, I think you meant COPPA.
I'm sorry. So yes, COPPA. My apologies. So COPPA is it regulates companies, it protects kids under 13, and COPPA is meant to really strictly regulate and minimize what is collected about kids online and how it is used. But like I said, companies play dumb. They try and get around it. And when they can't do that, they try and fabricate other theories of consent whereby they don't have to get verifiable parental consent. They can substitute the consent of somebody else. In this case, they try and say the school can consent as though it was the parent, and even over the parent's objections. Well, COPPA doesn't say that. There's nothing in COPPA that permits that. But we have a case right now that's up on appeal where not only is the company making that argument, they're going a step further and saying COPPA allows schools to consent to data collection as though they were the child's parent and collection and use as though they were the child's parent, even over the parent's objection.
Wow.
And then as part of that, schools can go a step further and actually bind kids and their parents to arbitration, which is private court. And so that a school, by making a kid use a software platform at school, can force a kid and her parents to waive their right to a jury trial,
Wow.
to waive a constitutional right. And so I think that, obviously falls apart every way you poke it. But the other thing I would think about is, okay, well, if I am a school security software provider, then I would just include a provision saying that everyone waives their Second Amendment rights and confiscating all the guns the parents have, because like where does this end, right?
Yeah.
And it really starts to get pretty absurd pretty quickly. And, I know we all have our favorite constitutional protections and stuff. So it's just really interesting that these companies are making these just totally wild, baseless arguments, but they are. And so we're going to take this up on appeal and feel very confident that we'll win. But it's interesting to hear them just say that your school can waive your constitutional rights of the kids and the parents just to access software.
Are you the first to actually challenge that in court? Has that not been challenged yet?
It has not been challenged yet. No. So we are, it's right there in the name. We're the EdTech Law Center, right? And so we're early to this. And so we are the first law firm bringing cases of this nature.
Do kids have any rights here at all? Like if the kids are hip and they realize, hey, I don't want my information stolen, regardless of what the parents say, what the school say, have kids challenged and pushed back on this stuff? And is there any precedent for them saying, no, I'm not going to install this ridiculous proctoring software that the videotapes me in my own room? Or do the kids have any rights here at all?
They do have rights, absolutely. Now, whether they'll be respected is a different question. But of course, they have rights, yes. And so as a minor, any agreement you sign can be voidable, right? And so if they force you to say, yep, you sign over all your data in order to access this proctoring software or in order to apply to college or whatever it is, you can actually come back and say, no, I'm a minor. I don't want to do that. I void this contract. And so, whatever you took, you have to destroy. Practically speaking, no one's doing that, right? And so minors can push back. I think there's a lot of normalization that's gone on here, though, and that's kids don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what it's like to grow up without all this stuff, right? And so when you have trusted people handing you things and saying, "Here, kid, use this as part of school. This is school now," most kids do, and I think that's what's partly so pernicious about this whole arrangement. Is just normalizing the situation where kids are surveilled all the time and data is collected about them all the time. And even really important rights are just surrendered or trampled over or shrugged off.
Yeah, I actually lamented on one of my interviews. I think it may have been to Chris Valise, who wrote the wonderful book, Privacy is Power. And it said, I'm worried that we are raising a generation of kids who don't know what it's like to have privacy. And they don't even know what they're missing.
Yes. Yeah, there's another... Book recommendations. There's a book that I read recently called The Right to Oblivion that talks all about, it's a philosophical inquiry about the value of privacy and the different natures and flavors of privacy and all of the rich ways we talk about it and think about it. But the metaphor that I love from that book is that privacy is the soil in which the seed of our self develops. And that it's not that we're hiding, it's not that we're concealing things, it's not that we're ashamed of anything. It's that we need this environment and this separation from the world to become who we're going to become. And the author does a much better job than me of summarizing it. But it's a really beautiful book and a great argument. Something I would recommend to your listeners.
Absolutely. I need to check that one out. So, okay, who are these ed tech companies? And are they names that we recognize? Are they subsidiaries of data brokers? Or how long have they been around? What sort of products do they make? And how do they ply their wares? How do they get these contracts?
So it's a lot of companies you've heard of, a lot of familiar names, and a lot of stuff you've never heard of. And so the familiar names are Google, which makes Chromebook, Google Classroom, Google Education, Apple, which has a suite of iPads and their own Apple products. Microsoft is in school. They provide the hardware, and of course, Office 365. And so you've got the hardware providers and kind of the productivity tool providers.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all pretty familiar. Then you have what are called learning management systems, which essentially are the administrative backend. And they might have some user-facing stuff too, but a lot of times it's more the backend stuff, the attendance tracking, all of the, education plan stuff, anything about kids' physical health and mental health, family relationships, all of those things. And then you have kind of the more student-facing stuff where kids are doing their assignments through these platforms, right? And so you have proctoring software, but you also have what they call personalized learning solutions, which essentially are algorithmically delivered questions that change based on your responses.
Mm-hmm.
And the pitch for those is that, we can differentiate and have 30 kids in the classroom and make sure that the smartest kid is getting really challenged, the kid struggling the most is being supported. But the independent research to validate those is casts a pretty dubious eye toward those claims and is also pretty thin. And so that's kind of the full stack of what ed tech really encompasses. So it's the hardware, it's productivity tools, it's this back end management, and then it's also the student facing side.
But there's also, I think, and the parts, all those things, if we had done the privacy and security right on those tools, I can, as an engineer, I can almost justify, yes, that I could see where those things might have value, or at least they wouldn't be harmful. The trick then is, okay, but then who are they selling it to out the back door, anonymized or de-identified? But then also, the types of tools that seem to really get us in trouble are anti-fraud tools. Things that are looking for plagiarism, things that are looking for you cheating on your test, things that are proctoring you while you're taking a test. That to me is almost it seems like a special segment of this that could be particularly problematic.
Right. Yes. So those anti-fraud tools are problematic in a lot of ways. And I think that the use of this surveillance paradigm, it just creates an environment of suspicion, right? And so you talk about even AI in schools, that the fact that it's possible means that everyone is casting a skeptical eye on, all student work now. And so there is this environment of suspicion. And so we've got these proctoring tools where you have to, submit to just constant computer monitoring of yourself and your surroundings. We know that those are racially biased and are less reliable in picking up darker skinned individuals. And so accuse them of cheating or leaving the room. And in a related category, we have, I talked about surveillance capitalism. That's a business model where people are covertly surveilled and their information monitored. There's a separate category of overt surveillance products that are used, meaning to stop, school shootings and kids committing crimes, kids hurting themselves. And they do that by, again, observing everything a kid does on their computer. There's this great ACLU report from 2023 called Digital Dystopia that looked into these tools and looked into the claims that they made and found them really lacking and wanting, and also detailed some of the harms of the false positives and false negatives, right? So these things are sold into schools saying, hey, we're going to prevent the next Uvalde. And we've talked to some folks who have been on the inside of these companies saying they actually use school shootings as marketing activations.
Oof.
So putting that grotesque thing aside, they often go to schools and say, look, we've got this AI-powered tool. We'll surveil all your kids all the time, and we'll be able to stop the next suicide and stop the next school shooting and do all of these things. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, they can't, and they don't. And so kids do get hurt. And, they're not stopping the suicides they say they're going to prevent. They're not preventing the shootings they say they're going to prevent. And all they're doing is eroding trust and eroding kids' sense of privacy. But then there's also the false positive, where they think a kid is a danger to themselves
Right.
or others, and they send the cops straight to that kid's house. Well, the kid and their family have no idea that this is even happening, that they're being surveilled in this way on their computer. And so it's bad all the way around. And so, I think removing the technology from the environment, there are a lot of ways to strengthen our human relationships that would help prevent or at least detect school shootings, self-harm before they happen.
Well, I've even heard of some other less violence-oriented ones that were still super creepy. Like I remember reading an article about a daycare that had video cameras on their kids. And I mean, as soon as I read this, I'm thinking like, this is the dog cam, so you can watch your dog when it's at doggy daycare, but for
Right.
your kids.
Yes.
And they had tools, AI tools, that would look at your child's expression as they came by to see if they're having a good day today, and
Right.
let you, and try to judge through AI whether or not they're frowning or something's wrong. And with older kids, they look for distractions. They look for whether or not they're looking down at their phone or whether they're paying, someone else is in the room with them and distracting them. And it's just super creepy. And then you throw AI on top of all that, it just gets worse.
Well, it's terrible. And you think about, what is that being used for? Right? Because it's like, it's really not for mom and dad to see how the kid is doing. It's really for a marketer to eventually understand, what an expression looks like on a computer or out in the world, and be able to hit a person with advertising when they're feeling vulnerable. Right? I mean, all of this goes down to, this is for someone else's benefit. It's not benefiting the people that they say it's supposed to benefit. That brings to mind another company that we sued. And this is a communications platform that, basically allows teachers to take pictures of kids and video of kids in the classroom, send it to mom and dad, so you can, stay apprised of what's happening in the classroom. You read this company's terms of service, they claim the right to use the likeness of every person that's
goodness.
on their system to make derivative works of their image or their voice. And the fact that they're claiming the ability to do that is really concerning. And the fact that there is no oversight or disclosure of, are they actually doing this, is really concerning. It doesn't seem like there's any deletion, any, removal of stuff that's, when your kid graduates kindergarten, why do you still have all the stuff of them from when they're in kindergarten? Do we really need this information in the first place? And so, no, it's really, when you think about it from a perspective of what's the worst thing that someone could do with this information for money, which is how I tend to approach it, it starts to get pretty dark.
Yeah. In the criminal justice system, I know, because I watch Law and Order,
Sure.
there's a notion of when you hit majority that like kind of like your childhood transgressions are bagged up and kind of separated from you. Like you give it a clean slate, except under extreme circumstances, you don't dip back into that and see what they did as a kid. Is there any notion or any proposed legislation around this today? Like any data collected on somebody before they hit majority, it should be expunged and divorced from their tracking persona. Is that a thing?
It should be. No, I think the policymaker understanding of this whole environment is really lacking. I think that the understanding of like what an identity resolution company is and does, what a data broker is and does, is just, people are way behind on it. The decision makers who need to know about this stuff just don't. And so I think that's an absolutely right paradigm. If we can't prevent it from being collected in the first place, at least we can prevent it from being used against you for the rest of your life. But I think the goal is the opposite. There's another company that's we're across from who has what they call cradle to career monitoring.
Just
right?
The phrase creeps me out.
Right. Yeah. And the idea is that, we want to be able to predict what kids are going to do based on applying an algorithm to their whole childhood, and, predict and force down certain career paths and open and close certain opportunities to them. And again, this isn't being done with their informed voluntary consent and giving them something more than the education that they're already entitled to. This is just being imposed on people. And so, I love that idea. And I think that it really is consistent with how we've treated childhood under the law for a long time. And, one thinks about our various presidents and all of their youthful indiscretions
Right.
and stuff, and how they joke about them now, that you can joke about, having snuck out of high school and smoked pot or, cocaine or whatever, underage drinking, whatever they all did. Well, now you can't run from that, right? There is no do-over. There is no improving yourself. There is no growth. You're just kind of put into a box of you're a bad person with, whatever, a criminal record, a drug problem, whatever the case may be. And that follows you around forever. And, if I'm a marketer, that's great, because if I knew the exact contours of your brain and every nook and cranny of your psyche, well, I could use that to my advantage. I could
Right.
really do a lot with that information about knowing, your deepest childhood fears, for example. That's valuable information. I don't think it's information anyone should have, but
Right.
if they're unregulated and looking to make a buck, that's the information they're going to try and get.
So back briefly to the contract thing, I have to assume that the administrators, and maybe even if the school department has a dedicated IT department, that they're probably woefully unprepared to review these contracts, dig through what's going on, and understand the implications, the privacy implications of some of these things they're doing. Yeah, maybe I'm wrong, but like my uncle was the head IT guy for his school system back in Indiana, and he was a sharp guy, and they were lucky to have him, because I'm pretty sure he was the exception, not the rule. How can we expect modern school administrators to be able to look at these things and either push back on the contracts, ask them for changes to the contracts, or understand them well enough to know, no, that's creepy, we're not doing that?
Well, it's really hard, right? It's really hard. And I think that the problem is kind of, folds in on itself, where if they had the resources to evaluate all of these contracts and really dig into everything, they also would have the resources to have small class sizes and give
Sure,
kids
right.
the individual attention that they need, right? And so
Right.
thus making all of this technology less necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And so no, and this is something where I really try to keep a very open heart when it comes to school administrators, even ones who I think are really making very bad decisions, because there is so much industry propaganda and pressure here.
Mm-hmm.
They're under so much pressure in so many other ways. It's very, I'm not a teacher. I would not presume to have any opinions about how hard it is, other than I bet it's really, really hard, and probably even harder than I think it is. Everybody goes to school and it feels like they get to have an opinion on, on teaching, but they're professionals just like you and I are. A teacher is an engineer, is a lawyer, is a doctor. And so I don't want to at all, denigrate the efforts of folks in these positions at school. I just think that they're outmatched. And I also think that companies don't have any requirement to keep them honest. They're not being audited. Their practices are not being fully disclosed. They're always extremely cagey about what information they're taking and how they're using it. And so, I really have a hard time finding too much fault with school districts.
Well, and I'm sure there's also a financial aspect to this as well, where, and I think this leads well into the next question, is that a lot of these schools are strapped for cash. A lot of these contracts probably come with kind of perks and things like, for instance, I'll provide you the hardware for your kids. So let's talk a little bit about hardware. Google, as you mentioned earlier, provides like Chromebooks to many school districts, and which, by the way, are fantastic little cheap laptops. Actually, they tend to be pretty secure overall. They're not private, but they're secure.
Right.
And then Apple, as you said, I know Apple's had some programs where they provided iPads to schools, and I'm sure that kind of sweetens the deal in some of these contracts and makes them really attractive to these schools. But are there unique privacy considerations for hardware devices? We've talked maybe more about software, but when I'm providing actually physical hardware, how does that add a new wrinkle to all this? And are students required, for example, usually when you get a Chromebook or an Apple device, you create an iCloud account or a Google account. Do they have to create accounts? Are those tracked the same way? Are they treated somehow specially? How does a hardware provider add a new twist to this?
Right. So the hardware piece of this is really interesting. And so there's been this move toward what they call one-to-one environment, one-to-one computing, basically meaning that every kid gets their own personal computer that they do all their schoolwork on and take home with them. At the most extreme end of the spectrum, right? And if you think about, well, who does that benefit? It's the people selling the computers. Some schools are less that way, and there is still one-to-one, but they have to keep them at school. Others have just like a laptop cart that kids take things out in class and use the laptops, or iPads just as needed in class. The old school computer lab, I think, is all but dead, unfortunately. And so, certainly in elementary school, which, I think the computer lab back then was still pretty simple. High schools probably still have them for more advanced, computing and coding stuff. And so, no, there are absolutely, concerns around the hardware being provided, starting with it is marketed to kids and given to kids that is not designed for kids. And so if you think about everything in a school, if you think about going into a kindergarten classroom and how physically different that classroom looks from a high school AP chemistry lab, right? Well, we're basically giving every single kid the chemistry lab, beginning in kindergarten and saying, hey, kids, good luck. School, make sure you take out all the dangerous stuff. We're not labeling the bottles of acid and the bases and everything else. It's up to you guys to figure all that out. Just make sure nobody gets hurt. And also that they can learn while they're here, even in this environment not created for them. And so I think there's a fundamental flaw with this idea that white collar consumer or productivity technology is appropriate for children. No company has sat down and said with a blank page, if I was trying to design for the physical and emotional and intellectual needs of a 5-year-old, what would that computer look like? And so I think there's a world where that's possible, but those things need to be incentivized into coming into being. And that's part of the work that we're trying to do.
So I'm sure there's already been several lawsuits filed against EdTech companies. Maybe I'm wrong, but beyond what you guys are already doing, can you give us some highlights? Like where's the current status of these kind of lawsuits? Have we learned anything from any of these suits already through discovery, or what has been brought to light already?
So the stuff that's been brought to light has been mostly through reporting and leaks and less about lawsuits. And so the direct EdTech lawsuits like we're bringing are still in the really early stages. And so nothing has gone to trial. Nothing from our cases that we've learned is really public yet. But I will talk about, and this is a company that we've sued, but this has been publicly reported in the press. And so we sued PowerSchool back a year and a month ago, back in May of 2024, for data privacy violations, saying that essentially they amass a trove of information about kids without the proper consent. And one of the harms associated with that is that it's vulnerable to hackers. One of the reasons that PowerSchool was even on our radar, though, was there was a report in the Markup, which is this great online publication in 2022, that talked about how the information that PowerSchool collected on kids at school was being misused even when it wasn't hacked. And so one of the things they talked about was there's this college application software called Naviance, and it's meant to help kids, find the college that's a good fit for them. PowerSchool sets it up so that beginning as early as like kindergarten or first grade, kids are taking like career interest surveys, and there's these behavioral surveys. So they're building this very long record well before a kid ever decides, whether they're going to go to college or what kind of job they want to get. And so first of all, you have this very long-standing and I think pretty comprehensive and invasive profile on a kid that the kid doesn't even know exists. Well, and then there's this other side of the market. When a kid does apply to college, then the other side of the platform allows colleges to market to kids. And so it's not just this neutral match of, okay, well, I am the best fit for Purdue like yourself or A&M like me. It allows other for-profit colleges or things that may not be the best fit to present themselves as though they were an authentic match for kids. So that's deceptive and confusing.
Wow.
And it also allows colleges, or at least at one time did, according to the reporting, to target in a discriminatory way opportunities. And so there were reports of colleges targeting engineering opportunities only to white males that were performing, slightly above average. And they weren't targeting those opportunities to other students of other races and genders. Wow. And so that is a problem when it's even being used as kind of as intended, or at least as permitted. But then you've got this hack, right? And so, as I mentioned, we sued PowerSchool in May of last year, saying, "Look, all this stuff, it's a ripe target for hackers." And then, sure enough, they were hacked. Oh, they were hacked in December of 24, just a few months after we filed our suit, and public reporting on that showed that just a massive trove of information was taken from children, not just the normal name, address, social security number, all those things, but these really sensitive medical records, mental health records, records relating to, parental restraining orders, all this really sensitive stuff that you can imagine. Well, of course, a school needs to know this,
Yeah.
but nobody else does. And not
Yeah.
everybody at the school does. And then when
Right.
that need to know vanishes, then these records should be destroyed, But it was revealed in reporting that no, actually 40 years of school records were taken.
Wow.
Covering, over 60 million students or former students and 10 million teachers. So it was just a tremendous hoard that reportedly was taken.
All right, so let's talk about potentially solutions or mitigations here. If I'm the parent of a student today, how can I determine what the privacy risks are for my child? Do I know, or can I determine what data about them is being collected and by whom and for what purpose? And if I have concerns, maybe I can't even find that out, and that's concerning, which it should be. What recourse do I have as a parent of a student today?
Well, less than I would like to tell you. It's difficult, right? Practically, it's very hard. You have a lot of rights, but those rights only really exist insofar as they're respected or that you're willing to enforce them. And so, not to set people up with this immediately adversarial relationship with their school, because like we talked about, I think schools are in some sense victims here too. But what a parent who's concerned about this stuff should do is start asking those questions. What programs do you use? Can you give me a complete list of those programs? What have you done to vet and validate their privacy policies? Do you audit them? Do they make disclosures? What are their security policies? Is this really necessary? I mean, is there not a way to achieve the same outcome, but without collecting information on my family and my kid? And so start having those conversations with your schools and frankly with other parents in your kid's class. That's a good place to start. But no, I mean, it's very difficult right now because most schools tend to refuse to accommodate parents who don't want to, have their kids be a part of this.
So I assume that the decisions being made on some of these contracts and what tools are being used is at least at the school district level, and possibly in some cases at a state level if it's something that's mandated statewide. So where do I take my concerns to? I'm guessing not to the principal of my high school. Where do I normally go to raise these red flags?
Well, it's top down and bottom up, which is the really interesting thing
Great.
about this. But you're right, exactly. So it makes it very difficult. And so, yes, some policies are being set at the state. Some are at your school district level. But sometimes, and companies do this on purpose, they'll market directly to teachers and say, hey, teacher, use this thing in your classroom. It's great. So a teacher will adopt it, and then it'll just be being used without any official oversight or policy. And so I do think going to your school board is probably the right place to start because those are the policymakers. But you got to do that with strength in numbers, right? If it's just you by yourself, it's going to be challenging. And so, as I mentioned, I've been an activist in this area for a long time. So I've seen what's effective and what isn't. And so, when you're thinking like an activist, you really have to try and persuade people to, that you're on the same side and recognize that you're on the same side and find that common ground. And so building strength, building community, helping other people in your school understand these issues, and then go in a coordinated way to your district. And what I've seen be successful is parents' technology advisory committees, where we will say, we understand that you have the best intentions here, and you're trying to prepare our kids for the future, and that you're really strapped for resources to do this oversight. So why don't I find other parents who are technologists or who are lawyers who have the time and the means, and we'll help you vet this stuff. We will help you evaluate this in a way that you may not have the resources to do right now. And then together we can collaboratively make decisions about what technology to adopt and why. That model I have seen be successful. Even that was a really long road for the parents that did it. But I think realistically, that's the only way that you can think about success, because otherwise I do empathize with school leaders. Parents complain about all kinds of stuff, and it's like people complain about crazy stuff all the time. And so if you don't know about these issues, a lot of what we're talking about can sound overheated or crazy or just irrelevant to the school mission. And so I do think that school leaders are kind of instinctively biased against complaining parents. And so the goal is, don't be a complaining parent. Be a partner who's there to help provide resources and solve a problem.
Are there any obvious red flags that you could tell us to look for, like as a parent or even as a student or teacher or administrator? What are there any with some of these tools, the way they're marketed or some of the features they have or some of the elements of the contract, are there any obvious red flags that should get you concerned, or like, what are some common dark patterns maybe that they might be using to try to get people to consent or schools to buy stuff that they shouldn't be?
Sure. So the darkest pattern of all is coercion, right? And so that essentially that this consent doesn't really exist, and they're not getting consent from the right people. They're getting consent from the district through these click-through contracts, right? And then you think about the way that the stuff is sold in the schools and the fact that it's just always a one-sided story, right? That this is always being framed in terms of ed tech, will give your kids 21st century skills. It will support equitable access to the internet so that everybody has access to this amazing resource. And it will allow every learner to get an education that's tailored directly to their needs, right? So that like I said, the more advanced kids are challenged and the kids who struggle more are supported. The problem is, like, those all sound really great in theory. None of them actually hold up to scrutiny, right? Mm-hmm. Because 21st century skills, well, kids are less computer literate now than they were in 2018. We have the data.
Wow.
That they spend more time in front of a computer, but they're not learning about a computer. And I think that's really important to distinguish those things. The time with a computer is not time learning about a computer. When you think about equity, we talked at length today about the surveillance business model. And we know that the people that are most harmed by that are usually the most vulnerable people in society, and the way that surveillance capitalism encodes pre-existing patterns of bias and discrimination. And so giving kids, cheap Chromebooks that are run on a surveillance model is really just exposing them to these harms and just entrenching those harms. And so, personalized learning, that is propaganda for just more computer-based learning. But it was meant in the 80s essentially to kind of help teachers reframe that you can't just teach only to the smartest kid in the class and then be mad when the other kids don't catch up, right?
Yeah.
That people have different learning styles and you need to, in a human way, meet them where they are. And so that term has basically been turned totally on its head, where personalized meant there is a person there with you, helping you, understanding you. Well, now it's the person is out of the way and the computer is the only thing delivering your education. And so, so there is just a lot of industry propaganda that's gone unrebutted, and I think not interrogated sufficiently, but, for more or less understandable reasons.
So in your mind, what is the responsibility of the school in this, either the district or maybe someone at the state level? Where does their responsibility start and stop, and what resources might they have? Is there a coalition of school districts somewhere that helps to vet these things, that they share information? What resources might people at the school level have for investigating or evaluating some of these tools?
Well, I think as we bring more of these issues to light, the defense of ignorance becomes less plausible, and so I think that's going to be part of it. And we've seen this a little bit like with phone policies in the school, right? Where when I started this 6 years ago, I was completely for not letting kids have phones in school, because I knew this wasn't about kids being bad or getting into trouble on their phone. This was about kids being manipulated and having their attention drawn away from school in the first place. And so, and knowing that they're powerless against those forces. And so it's not really about bad kids. It's about creating an environment conducive to learning. That was radical 6 years ago. It's happening all over the country now. And so as our work searches more of these practices, I would expect schools to pay more attention to this, and also to really start questioning, interrogating industry messaging. That are we really teaching kids 21st century skills? What are those? Who says any of this is inevitable? What are the durable skills that we need, that schools have always taught? And those, I think, are how to build friendships, how to focus your attention. I mean, really just mastering your own ability to concentrate and focus, being able to do boring things repetitively until you're able to achieve something. And that satisfaction of achievement is really different than the instant gratification of gamification that is correlated with a lot of learning now. And so, I guess it does feel like I'm getting back on my ivory tower, but just thinking about what is the point of education? What are we even doing here? And what can we do in a world where half of kids today, young people, according to this UK survey that just came out, wish they could be raised in an environment without the internet.
Wow.
Wish that they lived in a childhood where there was no internet. That's half of
Wow.
British kids age 16 to 21 said that, just like in a survey released last week. And so we can give them that, at least for 7 or 8 hours a day. We can give them that world where they're not on this internet, because this internet is really coercive, extractive, manipulative, and destructive. This is not the only internet that has ever existed or will ever exist. We can make a better internet, but this internet stinks, and they're saying it themselves. And so I would just say, think about that. Think about what you can provide kids, emotionally, and in the sense of giving them the ability to form community, form friendships, and just not be in this toxic online environment that we're all, drowning in.
And knowing everything that I know and doing this on a day-to-day basis, I keep waiting for the tech lash. I keep waiting for adults to rise up and push back and cause change. Wouldn't it just be amazing if it turned out it was our kids that were the ones that led that charge?
Well, right. I'm hoping that I'm roped in with the kids, because kids, I've been on your side this whole time. I've been on your side this whole time. And so, don't cast me out of the village. And God, what's the 80s movie I'm thinking of? Logan's Run? Anyway, yeah, I'm on your side, guys. I'm one of the good olds.
Don't trust anybody over 30. That was the 60s mantra. Then everybody turned 30. Okay. Anyway, last question before we go. Is there anything that we could be doing to better protect our children from excessive data gathering? Just kind of general tips. And under what conditions might somebody, for example, approach you guys and your firm if they've got something they think might be a legal matter?
Right. And so the first thing is just limit your kids' exposure to the internet generally. We do, and we were doing this well before we started this law firm. And I tell you, it wasn't because I was so smart or so good-hearted or anything. It was that I realized really early on it was easier to do no YouTube and no phone time with my kids than it was to do some. And out of an entirely self-protective instinct for my own time, my own sanity, I was like, we're not doing this. Like this is no way to live. And so, so we just kind of started on that path pretty early on. And then, fortunately, we were informed by Julie's work with the Judicial Commission on Mental Health, where she was learning about the early links between screen time and poor mental health for kids, especially young girls. So that, provided some scaffolding for our decisions. But yeah, it's like they don't really need it. They don't need it. And so if only do something online that you have to do online, and that will really limit, data gathering, I would say avoid YouTube if you can. If you're going to be on the computer, use private browsers. Privacy Badger is great. Firefox and Brave, I guess Brave is still a recommended one. So there are those things, but really just try and keep your kids offline. Get them printed books. If you're going to play video games, they don't have to be online. It doesn't have to be Fortnite. You can get an old school Nintendo or even a newer Nintendo and just do it together on the couch next to one another. Just think about these human experiences that are collective and not isolating. And so that's how I think about it. Because if you're doing that, you're also preventing your kid from having all their information sucked up and gathered about them. And then as far as your second question of what people can do if they think they have a legal issue, is that they can reach out to us. So we're the EdTech Law Center. Our website is edtech.law. We have a contact form. And so fill the form out and let us know what's on your mind and what's concerning. And so if there's a platform that your kids are using that's raising eyebrows, let us know. That's how we've gotten to know all of our plaintiffs so far, is these are people who are concerned about these and wondering, well, what are they doing with all this information they're taking? And so, it can be that, or if your child has suffered a more immediate harm from their school computer, and as we talked about at the beginning, that could look anything like persistent distraction in a way that's affecting their grades, or even just your family relationship, all the way up to these more difficult and concerning harms that I have a strong sense are very widespread and they're just not talked about. And so, if your young child, or frankly, any minor child, is being exposed to pornography at school or ultra-violent content at school, if they're talking with strangers, if they've sent photos of themselves to peers or others, these are all design flaws. These are not parenting flaws. There's nothing wrong with your kid. They've been put in an environment where these things that are happening to them should not be allowed to happen. And so I would just try to encourage people to come forward with these issues. We're here and ready to talk and just understand that, these things are only happening by design. And they don't have to happen. They don't have to be this way. Kids don't have to be in this environment. And the only way we can change it, at least right now, is by raising awareness, taking action in the courts.
Well, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. It's important work, and I wish you all the luck because you'll probably need it, unfortunately. But we need, what you're doing to have some effect and have some benefit for our kids. So thank you very much for coming on the show and educating us on what's going on.
Well, thanks, Gary. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I'll be happy to come back anytime.
So I want to say thanks again to Andy for coming on the show and helping us understand what's going on with our kids in schools these days. And it's really something that we need to be paying a lot more attention to and getting involved where we can. Certainly if you are the parents of kids in school, or I guess preschool in some cases, as we discovered today, get engaged, learn more about these things. There actually are some good resources out there for parents. I put links in the show notes to the books and reports that Andy talked about, and of course to the EdTech Law Center itself, which lists the current cases that they have open, by the way, if you want to check out those cases. And I think they even kind of update them as they go so you can see where the progress is with those cases. And obviously, if you have a situation where you think you might have a legal case, reach out to them. If nothing else, I'm sure that Andy and his wife can provide you with some very useful advice and resources. So again, check the links in the show notes. I also put links to a few articles that I think you might want to read that are related. There was one from the ACLU, one from the Markup about a study that they did, and also a Patron blog that very recently came out and talked about EdTech, which was pretty comprehensive. So that's a good read with lots of links to other articles to read. If you missed my interview with Lisa Lavasser or Irene Knapp from Internet Safety Labs, you might want to go back and check those out. But I've put a link to their site in the show notes as well. So there will be bonus Q&A for the patrons as usual on Thursday. We talk a little bit about Andy's origin story. Those are always interesting. We talk about what's going right and not going right around the whole privacy thing right now. We talk a little bit more about what you can tell your kids about privacy and how you can kind of, help them understand what's going on, even though at those young ages, they really don't have the life experiences to understand it. So how do you get through to them that privacy is important? And we even talk a little bit about online age verification, which has been a hot topic lately, particularly now that the Supreme Court has ruled that the Texas law for age verification can stand. It's a really thorny topic. And Andy had a very, very deep and careful response to that question. So anyway, patrons will get that bonus content on Thursday morning as usual. Couple quick notes. DEF CON and B-Sides Las Vegas are only about a month away. It does look like I'm going to be doing a book signing at DEF CON. I will have a 1-hour slot at some point during DEF CON. I'm not sure exactly when yet. I will have an amount of books. I'm really trying to figure out how many I'm going to bring because I actually have to pay for them myself ahead of time. And you'd be surprised at how little of a discount I get as an author on those books. And then I've got to ship them and blah, blah, blah. I've actually don't think I've done a book signing like this ever, so it's kind of a new thing for me. But I'm going to give it a shot, and hey, if you're going to be there, come on by and get a signed copy of the book. Got a new show for you next week as normal, and then after that, the interview will be with Deviant Olive. He is a really interesting person, and we have a really great discussion. He is a master locksmith and safe inspector, maintenance person, but at the end of the day, he knows how to pick locks and crack safes. But he is also just a very interesting person. That's going to be a great interview. I can't wait for you to hear that one. I just interviewed Cory Doctorow, so he'll be back, I think, for his 6th appearance on the show, which I think makes him the person I have interviewed the most. I will also be talking with Monique Priestley. She is a current member of the Vermont House of Representatives, which I believe makes her the first sitting elected official that I've interviewed. She is going to be very interesting to talk to. She's done a lot of work around privacy legislation. So we're going to have a nice behind-the-scenes look at that sort of sausage making. And then I am really happy to announce that I've reached out to Carissa Veliz. I told you I wanted to do a show about artificial intelligence. And it turns out, I think her next book is going to be on this topic. But regardless, that will be the subject of our interview. If you did not hear our interview about her book, Privacy is Power, you absolutely must go back and listen to that. She's a fantastic person to interview. She's a philosophy professor and has very unique and insightful things to say about privacy. So I'll be interviewing her probably in August, so you'll probably hear this in September about the ethics of AI, or maybe lack thereof. All right, that's going to do it for this week, everybody. Take care, stay safe out there, and until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.